Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the 61st Annual Seminar on Glass, hosted by the Corning Museum of Glass. I am Catherine Larson, the museum's curator of ancient glass, and I'm just delighted to welcome you this morning to our keynote talk by Alison Mickle. I'll introduce Dr. Mickle in a moment, but I just want to orient everyone briefly that you can place any questions for Dr. Mickle in the Q&A feature. And you may also use the chat to interact with other participants. And our technical support team is available and you can reach them through the chat as well. We will have a bit of time at the end for those questions, so please do feel free to think about them and add them as they occur to you. Just a reminder that the Corning Museum of Glass does not tolerate hate speech of any kind and will ask that you please keep those comments respectful and supportive. So it's really my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Alison Mickle, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of Global Studies at Lehigh University. She received her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University, and Mickle is the author of Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, A History of Local Archaeological Knowledge and Labor, which was published in 2021 and won the G. Ernest Wright Book Award. It's one of my favorite publications. Here it is here. Alison's research focuses on how local communities have impacted and been affected by the long history of archaeological work in the Middle East. I've been following Dr. Mickle's research for some time, and I'm so happy that she agreed to deliver one of our keynote lectures for this year's seminar on glass. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kate. I will assure you that the pleasure is very much mine. I'm completely honored to have been invited to give this talk today, and I'm so glad that we're coming back together after a long postponement. So with that being said, I will jump right into it. Kate yesterday recounted the history of the work that has been done at Jalomé starting in 1963, leading to excavations starting in 1964. Those excavations, which lasted for 3 seasons, broke, of course, for the 1967 Six-Day War, and then further probes leading up to 1971. We've heard a lot about what was so exciting about those excavations, that these were the first ancient glassworks excavated in an orderly fashion, according to Yala Gorin, who spoke yesterday. And these excavations led up to the sort of authoritative publication in 1988, which outlines the excavation activities, the major findings, and as Kate also spoke about yesterday, lots of areas of uncertainty. But reading this publication, I think one could be forgiven for not knowing who physically moved the soil and recovered this assemblage. We get estimates of sort of approximate numbers of workers and diggers, but not an exact number. We see the use of passive voice, where we hear that an experienced digger, erasure, was lent to us by the French Archaeological Mission in Israel. The workmen are not named directly, but the artists, the draftsmen, and the photographers are. So we hear about Jonah Barton, John Hufstadt, Carolyn Long, Anna Spanu, Kathy Calloway. Sort of these expert documenters are named in the publication, but the workers and diggers are not. Which I think leads to this question, which guides a lot of my work in general. What did it take to carry out this excavation? And in the case of Jalomé, what did it take to excavate this glass? But I want to think about this question truly as archaeologists from an archaeological perspective and from the position of archaeological expertise, not just thinking about sort of the physical work of excavation or a political economy perspective, or even really an epistemological perspective of sort of what knowledge was produced or what enabled the knowledge production about glass. I'm not just thinking about findings and funding and social structure and institutional buy-in, or even just about labor management, but I also really want to ask questions about the demands that glass places on us as archaeologists and on workers who participate in excavation, by virtue of its behavior and its materiality. And so I actually want to also ask a version of this question that places glass at the center as an agent that has directed how we investigate the past. I want us to ask how the material properties of glass have ultimately shaped the history of archaeology. And in coming to this talk, I was immediately struck by my sense that glass and labor have in common a translucence. Labor in particular has been erased and sort of seen through in the history of archaeology. And so in order to answer these two questions for Jalomé and elsewhere, I think we also have to ask, what will it take to see clearly all of the work, all of the labor that has gone into creating this archaeological collection and others. Because it is my contention that labor has been rendered see-through through processes that I will map out in this talk. Ultimately, finding labor and using it as a lens, to me, is key to answering these three questions of how this assemblage and so many others came to be. Part one of my talk is labeled fragility. I want to focus on the concept of shattering and of breakability. And I do really mean that literally. I think it's maybe sort of obvious to say that glass is breakable, but Quinn and Swab in their 2019 publication really went a step further and said outright that glass is the classic brittle material. And in fact, this is even more true at Jalomé, where in the same study, they found the glass to be less fracture resistant than contemporary glass to a statistically significant degree. So the Jalomé glass is extremely breakable, even in a context where glass as a whole is of course, quite breakable. But glass, of course, is not the only breakable artifact. Pottery as well is very fragile or friable, and it can be hard to spot and recognize. Coins can sort of slip from view and easily disintegrate in our hands. And all of these artifacts, glass, pottery, coins, and so many others, really demand care and attention to excavate them. It is not possible to recover them without a lot of patience and, in fact, a lot of skill. And this has been expressed in interviews that I've conducted with former site workers in Jordan and Turkey, where I've interviewed hundreds of people who have been employed to work on various long-running archaeological excavations. And so the quote on this slide, I think, really exemplifies the expertise that a site worker brings to an excavation. So this is from a site worker in Petra who says that he uses the pick when there are many stones, but when the sand changes, he has to switch to a hand pick and brush, especially if he wants to find a floor or coins or small finds and figurines. He gives a sense of when you find a pot, there's a way to acclimatize it to the changing sort of environmental conditions. So he's found that if you find a complete pot, you want to cover it with sand, leave it overnight to, he says, let the oxygen in, and then you can dig it out the next day and it won't break, but it might break otherwise. The important point here is that it's the artifacts that are dictating the methodology. The skill of the laborers comes from recognizing what the artifacts require, what they demand in order to be recovered without damage. And so if we want to answer the question of what it took to excavate the Jalomé glass, I think we have to center in the analysis the very fragility of objects like glass, which have shaped the way that archaeology gets done. The objects dictate the methodology, not really the other way around. Their breakability, the breakability of these artifacts necessitates skill from workers. But if the fragility of artifacts means that workers must be capable and reliable, the question remains why labor has been so hard to see for me and for other researchers in archaeological publications, as we've seen from Jalomé, but really kind of across the board. And that's what I want to address in part two, which I'm calling transparency. Of course, it's not just at Jalomé that workers are rendered transparent or invisible. They are nearly invisible in archives from excavations truly in general. except for sort of offhand mentions. Maybe an especially skilled worker will be mentioned often by first name only. They might appear in photos or drawings. And so what I have on this slide is photos and drawings from the 1870s up to the 1940s, mostly from sites throughout the Middle East, where we see workers from a distance. We see their bodies, maybe we see the backs of their heads, but they're not really identified in these photographs. And this is about usually as close as we can come to developing sort of team lists of archaeological excavations from the past. And this maybe should stand out or be surprising or confusing given what I just was talking about, that artifacts demand a lot of skill and demand a lot of labor and expertise from workers. This sort of erasure or invisibility should be surprising. It maybe is less surprising when we consider the history of archaeology, where the early history of archaeology was very deeply entangled with colonialism and the racism that came along with colonialism. And these sort of twin forces of colonialism and racism really structured archaeology's origins, which I think is exemplified by quotes like these, where in 1904, we see Petrie talking about who makes a good worker and who doesn't make a good worker. And, you know, relies on these sort of ethnic stereotypes and really talks about people in this very dehumanizing way. It feels more like shopping for equipment or livestock than it does interacting with human beings or potential employees. Reisner in 1919, who I think notably is often, there's a lot of publications that sort of laud his relationships, his interpersonal relationships with workers. He still writes things like the native brutality of a half-civilized people is still alive in the hearts of the Egyptians. And then in 1958, James Henry Breasted is talking about contributing funding for a state-of-the-art archaeological research center and museum in Cairo, Egypt, and really designing that so that Americans and Europeans would really dictate the terms of that research center and museum. And so he says that $10 million, which is the grant that he's asking for from John Rockefeller, he refers to that as the price that one has to pay to save these people from themselves. And these quotes are not necessarily surprising. I'm not highlighting them to sort of call out or indicate the behaviors or ideologies of particular individuals, because of course, when we zoom out to the broader political economy of archaeology, we can see and recognize ways that archaeology has been conscripted into the expansion and endorsement of empire over decades and really over centuries. Artifacts have been moved and shipped throughout the world to lay claim to history and heritage. The negotiation of partage agreements, where excavation assemblages would be divided between a host country and a foreign nation in exchange for political deals, that has been well documented. The site highlighted in Syria is Dur Europa, which was doubled as both a dig site for excavation and a military outpost. Folks have written about the reconstruction of cities to look like contemporary European cities and the conscription of archaeology and cultural heritage in that project, like at Rabat in Morocco. The earthworks that I've highlighted on this page, as well as Great Zimbabwe, colonial powers have challenged their longevity and their distance in the past as sort of a claim to kind of terra nullius and the backwardness and primitivity of people living in places that colonial powers had their eyes on. And there's a lot of rhetoric around who can take care of the past that serves to erase contemporary communities in these places. We see contemporary communities as either sort of barbaric and incapable of taking care of archaeological remains, or just simply not there at all. And I'm listing all of this to emphasize the ways in which archaeology has been used to both materially and rhetorically justify colonialism. And that is one dynamic in the invisibilization of archaeological workers. I'm not sure that it's the whole story, though, and it maybe doesn't fully help to explain what we see in the Jalame publication, where we don't really see people at all. We don't see workers, hired workers. We don't see excavators. The photos of work in progress are largely of sort of landscapes or of archaeological remains or of artifacts. And that is indicative of a shift that has helped to invisibilize the labor of archaeological work. It is part of sort of this removing the human from archaeology that started in the 1950s and 1960s and continued onward. So moving forward into sort of the post-colonial era, in the 1950s and 1960s, we see a shift in recording systems that move from more interpretative humanistic modes to pre-printed forms and checkboxes in the service of sort of speed and democratization. And as I mentioned, the de-skilling of archaeology. So sort of making archaeology a procedure or a process that anyone can move through as long as they can read the form, they can participate in the excavation and knowledge production work of archaeology. I am far from the first to name this as a sort of key transition in the discipline of archaeology that removes people from it. But that's when we start to see this shift towards photography that is like fully clean, emptied of any evidence of people or tools or footprints. That really happens in this shift towards archaeology as a science and ultimately as sort of a rote process that doesn't require human agency or expertise or interpretation. In the 1990s, we saw in the US a movement towards creating a labor union for archaeologists. And in response, the kind of organization of commercial archaeology firms, along with several federal agencies, organized a strategy and lobbied the Department of Labor in the US to recategorize archaeological technicians as unskilled or semi-skilled laborers. And so in the 1990s, it is actually instantiated in US law that archaeological technicians are unskilled or semi-skilled. Of course, that is a US context. I'm not saying that is directly what's happening at Jalame, but I'm citing this as indicative of this broader shift in the discipline or in the field of archaeology to deny the skill of archaeological work. It is all part and parcel of this broad social and political shift to take human expertise out of the archaeological research process. But this creates a fundamental contradiction for archaeology. On the one hand, we have, as I said, these fragile artifacts that are demanding a lot of skill and care in order to recover them. But on the other hand, there is this colonial, racial, social, political, economic, and epistemological denial of that skill and expertise that the artifacts themselves are demanding. And so I think archaeologists have been left with this question of how do you trust workers with this very high stakes work when so many conditions and so much of the movement of archaeology is telling you that they're untrustworthy, that they are either sort of barbaric and they're under the colonial regime or just fundamentally unskilled workers. And so we see anxieties in archaeological literature. We see folks expressing fear that workers will damage artifacts. We see archaeologists expressing fear that workers will steal artifacts. We see archaeologists expressing concerns that workers will lie. They might fabricate false artifacts and try to pass them off as real. And so archaeology has really for a very long time been grappling with all of these anxieties that I think stem out of that fundamental contradiction between what the artifacts require from workers and what archaeology has invested in as an ideology around workers. And we see this expressed in manuals really across the 20th century that tell you how to deal with your workers if you're an archaeologist. We see various attempts to get around this fundamental problem of dishonesty or lack of skill. And it is a prevailing problem that continues up into the 21st century. So we see Barker in 2003 encouraging the archaeologists to make sure to check the provenance of finds by workers or unskilled volunteers. And so because this has been such a longstanding question of how do we fundamentally trust workers to get the job done and get the job done well, that led archaeologists beginning in the 19th century to come up with a variety of systematic ways for controlling the behavior of workers. So we see reward systems like bakshish, where workers are tipped for turning in artifacts and in fact for turning in complete artifacts. And there's been a lot written about sort of why bakshishas may be a problem and how that creates this market for antiquities and fosters the idea that artifacts have a commercial value that transcends their value to science or to heritage. But I think bakshish is an example of one of these systematic ways that archaeologists have tried to resolve that fundamental contradiction between what we need workers to do and what we trust workers to do. We also see systems of punishment. So this quote is from Kimbra Smith in Peru, but I have experienced it myself as well, where workers are moved to places that are dirty intentionally to sort of punish them for being slow or careless. They might be moved to a place, especially if bakshish is being offered, where they're guaranteed to find nothing. They might be moved to dangerous areas or areas with difficult team members. So areas that will be like difficult emotionally to work in. And then combined with these contrasting reward and punishment systems, we also see the emergence of surveillance systems starting in the 19th century, where archaeologists are very vocal about the need to supervise your workers, often from a hidden standpoint. So from a mountain very far away with a telescope, or from a high point of view where you can see the workers where they can't see you, really advocating for a panopticon sort of approach to archaeological work. And these systems might seem sort of like relics of the past, but they are very much still in place today. As I mentioned, I have experienced that punishment system of someone being moved as retribution for their untrustworthy behavior. We see rewards. Even though bakshish is very rarely practiced today, there is still an incentive for exciting findings and for finding things whole. And then surveillance is very much alive and well. Nicholas Zorzan has written about commercial archaeology projects that he's worked on that engage in frequent drug testing or require the commercial archaeologist to be supervised by camera. And so I think we're still inheriting this legacy of the needing to trust workers, but fundamentally being unable to trust workers because of this longstanding legacy. And so when we think about how the material properties of glass have shaped the history of archaeology, I think the fragility of glass and other artifacts really resist that de-skilling and have helped to give rise to these systems that are still in place today. That contradiction has created the anxieties of what if you hire somebody who isn't up to the task? What if you hire someone who is up to the task and they steal from the site? What if you hire somebody really skilled who can create a passable copy of an artifact? All of that has led to these systems of reward and punishment and surveillance that we're still using today. But even though we know that excavating fragile artifacts like glass requires skill, and we also know that that skill and expertise is erased through this de-skilling of archaeology and through the erasure of workers in archives and in publications, that the traces of that skill very much remain and persist. That expertise survives. It is rolling around in the communities that we work in and with. And so I work, as I've said, in Turkey and also in Petra in Jordan, where I've interviewed more than 100 former site workers who have dug with the American expedition to Petra, focused mostly at the Temple of the Winged Lions from the 1970s to the 2010s. The object in this image is an idol of El Uzza, who is a Nabatean goddess who was found at the Temple of the Winged Lions during that excavation. And one day, when I was sitting with a group of Bedouin men and women near the royal tombs in Petra, an older man named Musa joined our group. And he sat down and poured himself a glass of tea. And he just mentioned offhand that he had been working on the project at the Temple of the Winged Lions in 1975 when the El Oda tablet was found. The other people in the tent with us immediately started asking him questions about the statue. They asked, what level was it on in the excavation? And Musa answered, well, I would calculate that it was about 2 meters down. I mean, it was inside a part of the building that I didn't work in, but it was only about 2 meters down. And everyone paused to consider this information. And I was excited because absolute depths were almost never recorded in the site notebooks or archives from the Temple of the Winged Lions excavation. This particular object, the only record states that it was found in a particular bulk, that it was resting on SU 109. It records the measurements. It says it was inscribed in Nabatean. And so Musa's recollection really provided data to complement the details documented by the excavators. The fact that we were able to recover this level of specificity as far as absolute depth simply by talking to a former site worker illustrates how much important scientific information is preserved in the memories of individuals who spent summer after summer watching monuments and assemblages emerge from the ground, seeing how the archaeologists interacted with those objects. And I think the interaction between Musa and this group of engaged listeners sitting around us embodied and illustrated how that knowledge is kept alive and shared with others. I'm offering this story as indicative of a larger phenomenon that I've documented using and tried to map out and sort of get a structural understanding of using social network analysis, which is illustrated in this slide. Network analysis is a system of showing points of connection and maybe points of flow. And so I've attempted to build a network about that illustrates shared knowledge, where the blue dots represent site workers that I spoke to, the red dots represent archaeologists who documented their findings in the archives, and I connected them on the basis of mentioning the same artifact, either in oral history interviews or in the archive. And I could go very into depth about this network, but what I hope that it shows is that the archaeologists share a lot of consistent knowledge. A lot of them recorded things like pottery, bone, ceramic, glass over and over and over again. But the site workers often had very detailed knowledge about specific artifacts that were barely mentioned or were mentioned by only sort of one excavator, and often very briefly in the archives. And so the site workers possess this complementary knowledge to that which is recorded in the archives from the Temple of the Winged Lions. And I think this is true at a lot of archaeological sites. I don't think it's just true at Petra, but I've been able to show it sort of statistically using social network analysis at Petra. And ultimately, when you talk to people, this knowledge, this local knowledge washes up, erodes out. It is common and everyday, but at the same time, I think it is invaluable and irreplaceable. It really can't be recovered any other way. And we see evidence of this sort of local knowledge at Jalame. The story of how the site was discovered is rooted in local knowledge and in talking to people from the area who know the site very deeply. And so in answer to this question, how can we see clearly all of the work that has gone into creating this collection? I think it's apparent that this knowledge is preserved in the memories and in the communities and in the oral history and in the storytelling that communities of workers and their families the sort of practice of storytelling and handing down information that they practice. And so things like oral history, ethnography are tools to help us recover evidence of the skill and labor that excavation workers possess that has created the archaeological assemblages that we have, like this glass assemblage from Jalame. But it's not necessarily that simple. When we go and do that oral history work or that ethnographic work, it is easy to get a distorted view. It's very difficult to get a clear picture of labor or of expertise in archaeology. I know because that was my experience in Petra. Every time people shared with me examples of their knowledge and skills, when I would name that, when I would say, wow, you know so much about archaeology, they would deny being experts. They would tell me things like they knew how Roman and Byzantine and Nabatean pottery was different from each other, how to date these different pottery assemblages. But then they would turn around and say, well, we don't know anything about the science of archaeology. They would tell me about how far down you have to dig before you find the ash layer that sort of they hypothesized destroyed Petra. And I'd say, wow, you really know this landscape. And they would say, but I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know anything. They would tell me things like, they're just a simple goat herder. I don't have any expertise. And I heard this over and over and over again. And it was very curious to me because I was really doing my best to recover evidence of expertise by archaeological workers. That was my project. And so I couldn't ignore the fact that they were exemplifying their expertise, but on the other hand, denying it, not wanting it to be named as expertise. And it only made sense when I put it together with stories like this one, where workers would tell me about being demoted or fired, replaced with a family member if they asserted their expertise. So this quote comes from my friend Ahmed, who said that he didn't like working on archaeology projects because he would know that a pottery vessel came from a different date than a particular project was trying to link it to. And if he ever tried to tell them that or suggest that maybe other sites were dating this pottery differently, the archaeologists would say, no, we are right, we are the experts. And if you're a worker and if you come all the time to ask them, they'll become angry, and they'll say, stop, we only brought you here to work, you're not here to ask. I heard stories like this over and over again of people suggesting different conservation methodologies or different areas that archaeologists might focus their excavation. Even sort of details like people have excavated here in the past, you're re-excavating the back-dirt of a former project, and in return being financially punished. So having their pay docked, being suspended for a few days, or as I mentioned, being replaced with their brother. And so this has led to a phenomenon that I have called lucrative non-knowledge, where it actually pays to perform ignorance. It pays to perform a lack of knowledge about archaeological work. And I think this relates back to
All right, we appear to have lost Allison momentarily while we work on getting her back. Please stand by.
I apologize so much. My computer just crashed, but we're back. I'm really sorry. Yes, so this relates to this phenomenon that I've called lucrative non-knowledge, where workers who are experts, they will perform the work of experts, are expected to be silent about that expertise, not name that expertise, and in fact deny that expertise, and instead sort of perform ignorance instead and perform a lack of knowledge. And I think this relates back to that fundamental contradiction that I posed at the beginning, that the artifacts demand skill and demand this trust between project director and worker that archaeology has been constructed to deny, and so it has led to these sort of microeconomies at sites like Petra, where workers perform less knowledge than they have. And I think this is bad for archaeology. I think that as a science, we should be valuing exchange of expertise and dialogue and the sort of debate of different ideas. It is a very unusual situation to be producing scientific knowledge where debate and dialogue is discouraged, especially when it is a lot of the people who are closest to the artifacts and spend the most time with the artifacts, and certainly spend the most time at the sites where we work, who are being encouraged to downplay this expertise. I'm not sure how to click to the next slide. That is one thing I'm not sure. Thank you so much. And so we see in the Jalomé publication, Gladys Weinberg being concerned about the easier and more difficult aspects of ancient glassmaking. And so I think we have a particular call to pay attention to labor and expertise at a site like Jalomé, where there are examples of unsuccessful vessels and examples of a productive process that failed, and sort of these these traces of the evidence of skill and labor, and how those two things are intertwined. I think an archaeology of workmanship needs to be an archaeology of workmanship where we take craft and skill seriously in the past and in the present. So to return to our questions, again, next slide. Thank you so much. I think we can begin to build an understanding of the productive work that has created this assemblage and others by centering the fragility and defiance of the of the artifacts themselves. We can go to the next slide. I think, archaeology requires skill because of the material conditions of the traces of the past. Things like shards of glass and sherds of pottery, their small size, their friability, their subtlety, their elusiveness has all demanded a level of skill in excavation labor that has been invisibilized through shifting power dynamics in the history of archaeology. But we can see that skill when we apply a lens of labor that is applied across data sets. We can go to the next slide. I think you have to click a few times. Perfect. Thank you so much. This means reading archives against themselves, conducting ethnography that is aware of the risks posed when people expose their expertise, and maybe even most importantly, one more click, how we set up our excavations so that we reward knowledge exchange rather than feigned ignorance. And in creating exhibits that refract and illuminate the glimmers of labor that we see throughout the history of archaeology and the ancient past, that make it possible, maybe for the first time in archaeology's history, to take work, labor, and expertise seriously. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts.
Thanks so much, Allison, and thanks for coming back quickly, given
Yeah,
that.
so sorry about that. It's not great.
It's, I guess, life in the virtual world these days.
Yes.
So we have a couple questions in Q&A so far. one attendee is wondering how your work overlaps with a capitalist approach to the workforce in which industrial laborers are nameless and only management is treated as individuals. So kind of thinking about those kind of capitalist
Yes.
readings.
Yeah. I appreciate this question so much. I mean, I see, my work really is set in post-colonial settings where I think that post-colonial framing takes a lot of precedence, but I'm always struck when I present this work to commercial archaeologists working in US and Canadian and European contexts, and they see so much of themselves and their own experience in that. And so I think that a capitalist or ultimately an anti-capitalist lens is really appropriate to bring to excavation settings where even though we're not producing goods and objects, the sort of alienation of the worker from the products of his labor that Marx talked about is absolutely present in archaeology, where we see workers sort of contributing their labor to this broader outcome of a report or a publication or a physical assemblage that, especially in post-colonial settings like Jordan, where I work, but really also in the commercial sector, the workers don't really see the benefits of what they produced. And so I do take a critically anti-capitalist lens to this material. And this is where sort of the idea, where framings of theoretical frameworks around racial capitalism, I think, really help, because those two things can't be disentangled. But even archaeology that is not in service of sort of industrial capitalism, I think, has borrowed a lot in terms of labor management and hiring and firing and the de-skilling of the worker. I think we've inherited a lot of that, unfortunately, from capitalist settings. And I'm giving this talk from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the Taylorist scientific management of labor was born. And so I recognize a lot of that sort of like maximum output for minimum pay. I see that on a lot of sites, unfortunately, still in the present, but certainly in the past as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate your sort of reading through the Jalomé archive and information and publication itself, kind of looking for whatever traces were present there. And of course, Jalomé was one of these sites that used local labor. And my understanding is that it was largely immigrant, right? Jewish immigrants who were coming to Israel. And also undergrad labor, right, which is especially becoming more and more common in excavations now, and even where the undergrad students, usually from American or European universities, are working side by side with those local laborers. Can you talk a little bit about what those dynamics are like in the projects that you've observed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the question of student labor is one that comes up a lot for me. And there's been a lot of debate about whether the intellectual value that students get, like the learning experience they get out of participating in excavations, is sort of pay itself. It also comes up with grad students, where the idea historically was that grad students would participate in the project, their labor would be free, but they would have access to a data set that they could convert into a thesis of some kind in return for that labor. I think those arguments might have made more sense at a time when higher education was not as expensive as it is now, and when grad students were not so sort of resoundingly exploited as they are now. I think if you are not otherwise making a living wage, it's a lot to ask of our students to pay to participate on excavations. Even if they're benefiting intellectually from that exercise. And so, I think students kind of occupy this sort of strange space where I don't think that argument that they are benefiting more than a worker who's exchanging labor for pay. I think that argument holds some water. I don't think that's like the craziest thing to argue. But this is where, like, I'm always a big advocate for sort of zooming out to those broader structural conditions. And so if that's happening in a context where students ability to feed themselves and survive is also being eroded separately. I think it's a hard argument to make that this excavation is just so rich and so fulfilling that they should not even contribute free labor, but spend money to participate, which is what we so often see. The question about sort of immigrant labor and volunteer labor, I think, is particularly apt in the Israeli context, and that I would not be the first. I mean, that has been written about quite a lot by people like Nadia Abou-El-Hajj, who and others who talk about volunteering on an excavation or volunteering and handling artifacts as a tool of feeling a connection to the past and to place, and that has been a strategy used in Israel and other nations as part of the nation building exercise, where if you get people to handle the artifacts and feel like that they had a hand in building this history and they're deeply connected to this history, maybe this is their history and maybe they really sort of belong here. And so that is a dynamic that I think is particularly relevant in certain national contexts. Not as much so really in Petra that I see, but certainly in other places.
Yeah, thank you. Another question is, do you see generational or familiar transfer of knowledge? Are these skills sort of passed down within families? So that's part one of the question. Yes,
absolutely. 100%. I think partly because in Turkey, where I work, this is a very agricultural community. And so a lot of the sort of digging skills and recognizing artifacts is something that you're doing also in the agricultural field. And so in the off season, when there's not an archaeology excavation, fathers and sons are out in the fields and sort of passing down this knowledge. And then also hiring historically in archaeology has been very kin-based in the Middle East. So in Petra, there are kind of two competing families that have historically been hired depending on where you're coming from. So the German projects hire from one family, and the American projects hire from this other family, but they always hire within their families. And so you see a lot of generational transfer of knowledge because a father will advocate for his brother or son or cousin to also be hired on a project. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about your research methods and how you kind of use archaeological archives to kind of find some of this information for past labor practices?
Absolutely. So I will admit that this is actually easier in projects that have resisted that sort of de-skilling of archaeology. So it's actually in a weird way easier to find evidence of workers in older excavations, like pre-1950s. That 1950s to 1980s period is kind of a black hole for workers, because that is really when archaeology was invested in this project of removing the human element and of rooting down in the idea that archaeology is an objective, positivist, empirical science, which means that it doesn't actually matter who's holding the trowel or there aren't really decisions to be made in the excavation because it's a scientific procedure. And so the next step is sort of obvious. And so I have written a lot and researched a lot in archives from sort of that pre-1950s era, so 1890s to 1950s. And you tend to find evidence of the workers, as I mentioned, in photos or in diaries or sometimes in letters. And then post-1980s, as you see the advent of post-processualism and this acceptance that maybe it actually does matter who's doing the archaeology, then you can kind of find them again. But that's part of why I have invested so heavily in interview-based work, because even those mentions are still, they tend to be pretty offhand and tend to be pretty one-sided. They're from the perspective of the excavators. And so I'm a big believer in community-based research. So I work very closely with people from the local community to find others and to build a research program and to make sure that the questions that I'm asking are relevant to folks there. So so that's a lot of my research methods, but I'll just give a quick plug that the Bulletin of the History of Archaeology is about to come up with a special issue focused on archaeological labor, where a lot of the contributors are offering their thoughts on a range of different methods that might help us to locate labor, because it is so challenging to do. And so be on the lookout for that, because I'm really excited about that set of papers.
Yeah, that sounds great. I was really, when you were talking, having like this like visceral memory of sweeping out my footprints right before the site photographs. You mentioned that about like literally erasing the human traces to like create these sort of like artificially pristine environments. It was, yeah, I don't know, it really struck me.
Yes. And I hope this is okay to share that, so sometimes those human elements, those human traces are actually the most informative and the most useful when we look back at photographic archives. So at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where I've worked, there's been this longstanding question of why James Miller in the 1960s found these amazing like panels of wall painted figural wall paintings, like vultures and leopards, and just these amazing depictions and illustrations. And we haven't really found them, or found many of them in the contemporary excavations that started in the 1990s. And looking back at Miller's photographs from the time, in the photographs where they didn't clean out the human trace, you can see cans of red paint in the homes. And so I'm saying this not as like an accusation that he made it up entirely, although we do know that James Miller's relationship with the truth was
right.
So I mean, like, yeah, I don't want. So I'm not saying that he made them up out of whole cloth. And it is true that at that time it was more common practice to sort of touch things up for the purpose of a photograph. And so it's not sort of like a smoking gun or something like that. But it is. I mean, it is like, it's a clue, and it came out of not cleaning up all of the traces of the equipment and the people in the photos. So those photos are in a lot of ways more informative to us than the really, really cleaned up ones, which look nice for publication, but don't allow for debate and reconsideration, which is the heart of what scientific knowledge relies on.
I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. Do you have thoughts on, of course, a lot of language barrier is a big consideration in many of these contexts. Do you have thought on the ways that might contribute to some of this disconnect and othering of workers, both on site and in publications and other kind of dissemination of the findings, especially when, and I'm reading the question out, 20th century excavations in the Middle East brought together so much local and more distant workers that might not share a common knowledge. And the lack of Western archaeologists' proficiency in those local languages as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that has come out of my interviews, especially at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where there have been Turkish excavators on the project or people who spoke Turkish. And at times when they had more of those people, the workers told me that they felt more included and felt like part of the project in a way that when there weren't people who they could talk to, they felt excluded. Like it really was that simple. They were like, yeah, if you can talk to us in our language in a way we understand, we're part of the research process. And when we're not, we can't. So I think language barrier plays a huge role, which is part of why, there are still PhD granting programs in archaeology and in classics today that require, a contemporary, they'll call it a scholarly language very often, rather than, so if you work in Jordan, your PhD might have required you to learn like French or something, rather than Arabic, right. And certainly not, spoken colloquial conversational Arabic. And so there is this push from like, especially a younger generation of archaeologists or archaeologists coming out of these countries, where there has been a historical language barrier, to encourage archaeologists to learn the language before they come. And I think that has been treated as sort of just a skill that's like a bonus if you can get it, or maybe it's worth your while to invest in. It'll make your excavation easier, and it'll certainly be better or more ethical. But I'm increasingly seeing that as kind of like radical practice that I think that is part of like the revolution in archaeology, that will transform the type of knowledge we produce, because I don't know, I make a lot out of dialogue in science and the exchange of ideas and debate and holding things up against each other and holding interpretations up against each other and melding and mixing them. And that can only be done if you can share a language. So yeah, I do see a lot of value in that, and in moving away from the sort of like archaeology phrase books that are command based. So there is a publication available. It's Arabic for archaeologists, and the initial version of it was very commanding. The new one is a little bit better, but you're still not having like a friendly or robust conversation with anyone based on that. You're telling them to dig faster and dig slower, and the weather's hot. It's still not a mutual exchange of information. Yeah.
So I guess thinking a little bit more forward looking, do you have ideas for ways that archaeologists can really empower local people to advocate for themselves and preserving the history, building new skills? Sort of related is, have you ever encountered, like, would unionization be discussed or even help? I mean, that's such a sort of American construction in some ways, but what's like a path forward? So language would be one. What are other ways?
I think language is one. I think pay scales is another. And not just pay scales for sort of like loyalty or years on the project, which is something that we see a lot in archaeology, that like the longer somebody's been on your project, and the better you know them and the more you know their family. I mean, like paying people for expertise, like paying people for being skilled and knowledgeable, rather than sort of effectively paying them for being the kind of personality that you want to work with. And so I think that's really important. And then, I would say that unionization is a important step for workers. Although, as you say, like that a union is sort of a legal term rather than sort of a thing that exists and looks the same in all contexts. And so maybe I would say approaches towards collective bargaining rather than sort of unions per se. Where I work in Jordan, unions are very difficult to form at a national level and to be recognized. But the local community does shut down access to Petra when the government has crossed a line in their minds. So sort of asserting that kind of power, I think, is really important. And so my new project that I'm working on now is mapping the activities of a company called Sila that is not a union, it's a private company, but it is performing a lot of that that work that I'm mentioning, where they're training and certifying expertise, they're recognizing expertise, they're advocating for fair pay, safe working conditions, and for an investment in like Jordanian expertise. They're also working with the national government to rewrite the antiquities law so that Jordanian expertise is sought after. So if you want to come and work in Jordan, you will soon need to demonstrate that you've worked really hard to collaborate with Jordanians. And so they're combining a sort of like grassroots, bottom up, sort of making use of strategies of collective bargaining and pairing that with a really like top down investment in formalizing the recognition of expertise. And I think those two things combined has made them shockingly effective. It's very rare as an academic to write success stories. I think we often are so critical of things, as you've seen. I'm very critical of sort of the history of archaeology and labor. And so it's a little bit refreshing to be able to point to this and say, no, they're training workers in documentation. They're rewriting the law so that you don't always just get to bring your buddies and then pay workers next to nothing when you work in Jordan. So they're they're combining all these different strategies to make conditions for workers in Jordan much better, and it seems to be working really well. So those are sort of like the three takeaways that I see.
That's fascinating. As somebody who sits, and this is sort of by nature of my way of segue. Thank you again, Allison.
My pleasure.
As somebody who sits at this sort of intersection between archaeology and museum practice, and I see both communities really turning attention to community engagement in different ways. And that happens to be what we're going to be talking about at 1 o'clock, is ways that we engage our local community in working on the Dig Deeper project. So we'll be back at 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody who participated in our sessions this morning, everybody who listened, for being here, all our speakers, for really having some great thought-provoking discussions that I hope all of us will continue to kind of digest and consider in our work. So I'll see everybody back in about 45 minutes at 1 o'clock Eastern time, and have a great break.